They were not supposed to speak her name inside the building. That was the first rule. Not whispered, not written, not even referenced indirectly. The archivist who first told me that rule did so with the calmness of someone describing proper fire escape procedure, not fearful, simply factual, a matter of institutional safety, a matter of avoiding something that had already happened once. He said her name had a way of repeating itself in rooms where no one had spoken. He said it had appeared on documents that had already been typed and printed. He said the Vatican stopped recording her existence not to protect her, but to protect everyone around her. That's where this case begins, with a woman whose official file was erased, but whose absence continues to behave as if she were still alive. If you're here with me tonight, listening to this wherever you are, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Cases like these get buried on purpose. They only survive when people like you pay attention long enough for the truth to surface. Now, let's start. The woman you're about to hear about was not a saint, not a demon, not a myth, not a witch, at least not according to anything she ever claimed. What terrified the Vatican, terrified them enough to send people across continents, was not what she did. It was what she caused to happen around her. Unrelated events taking on patterns. Unconnected people speaking in synchronized phrasing. Objects that should have been inert reacting to her presence. And the worst part? People remembering completely different versions of the same moment after interacting with her. The human mind has limits. She knew where they were, and she stepped past them. Her name, the name no one wants spoken, isn't where the file begins. It begins in a small mountain clinic in northern Italy, inside a room where 3 professionals gave 3 different reports of the same interaction. The first report said she was calm. The second said she was violent. The third said she wasn't there at all. All 3 were signed. All 3 were time-stamped the same minute. All 3 describe her clothing differently, and all 3 end with the exact same sentence. She made me feel like I had already lived this day. That is the earliest known statement linked to her. A description not of a miracle, not of an attack, but of a fracture in perception. Something subtle, clinical, yet deeply destabilizing. When investigators asked the first witness if she meant déjà vu, she shook her head. No, she said. Déjà vu is familiar. This was wrong. It felt like she knew what I was going to say before I said it, and like I knew what she would answer before she did. This phenomenon continued everywhere the woman was taken. Guards thought they heard her walking behind them, even when she remained seated. Nurses charted conversations they couldn't remember holding. Doors were found open that had been locked minutes earlier, not broken, just mathematically incorrect in their sequence of opening. A pattern emerged, not supernatural in appearance, but in effect. People forgot what they witnessed. People filled in blanks that shouldn't exist. People behaved as if nudged by an invisible suggestion. Psychology has terms for influence, for persuasion, for collective delusion. None of those terms apply when people who never met each other describe the same impossible detail. She knew something about me she couldn't know. One guard reported that the woman recited the exact phrasing of a prayer he had whispered alone as a child. Another said she finished his sentence about a memory he had never spoken aloud in his life. A third swore she could predict which door he would choose in a hallway with 4 identical exits. But here is the part that turns this from folklore into a matter of institutional alarm. When they attempted to verify those claims, the witnesses themselves said they didn't remember giving the statements. The Vatican's psychological board called it episodic fragmentation triggered by emotional stress. But stress does not overwrite written testimony. Stress does not alter timestamps. Stress does not cause 3 separate video feeds to record 3 different versions of a hallway interaction. Yes, that happened. 3 cameras. Same hallway. Same moment. Camera 1 shows her walking alone. Camera 2 shows her escorted by a guard. Camera 3 shows an empty hallway. All 3 were authenticated. All 3 were backed up. All 3 contradict each other perfectly. The conclusion of the internal memo was simple. She induces localized perceptual instability. That is the coldest possible phrasing for something everyone else calls fear. Fear of a woman who never raised her voice. Fear of a woman who never threatened anyone. Fear of a woman who, by existing, forced people to confront the possibility that their perception was not their own. Let me be clear. There is no evidence she performed anything supernatural. She never claimed powers. She never invoked names. She never touched anyone in a harmful way. What made her dangerous is the absence of explanation. Institutions cannot tolerate a vacuum. They require cause and effect. She erased the cause and multiplied the effects. Before I continue, tell me in the comments, if you met someone who could describe a memory you never told anyone, someone whose presence altered what you believed you saw, would you think they were supernatural? Or would you think something inside your mind had cracked? Either answer is terrifying. After her 3rd institutional transfer, the board determined she could no longer be held in any facility that documented reality strictly. Their wording, not mine. They feared their own records were becoming unstable around her. She was transferred to a monastery with no digital equipment and no cameras. A place where memory could not be replayed, only written. Her first night there, the monks wrote identical entries. She asked us why we were frightened. We could not explain. What frightened them wasn't what she did. It was what they felt. Like she was familiar. Like she had been there before. Like she had already walked those halls, long before she was ever born. This is where the occult edge begins. Not in rituals or symbols or myths, but in a disruption of something foundational, temporal identity, memory, sequence, narrative. 3 monks reported hearing her voice from different rooms at the same moment. One heard her praying in the chapel. One heard her humming in the stairwell. One heard her speaking softly behind him. When they compared the moments later, they realized they had all heard her in the same second. She was seen sitting quietly in her assigned chamber during that time, not moving, not speaking, not humming, not praying. They checked the logs again. 3 witnesses, 3 locations, 1 timestamp, and no way to reconcile the data without assuming the event itself was distorted, like time had bent slightly. That is where part 1 ends, with the Vatican realizing they were not dealing with a miracle, not a possession, not a mythological archetype, but something far worse for their system. A woman whose presence destabilized the fundamental trust between perception and reality. If you're still here with me, tell me what you think happened to her mind and to everyone around her. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss part 2. This case is about to shift from strange to impossible. They believed moving her to the monastery would quiet whatever was happening around her. A place without electronics, without cameras, without medical equipment, without clocks blinking at the wrong moment. A place built before the idea of documentation existed the way it does now. They thought the silence would contain her. Instead, the silence made it clearer. The monks kept handwritten logs of her behavior. They weren't investigators. They weren't psychologists. They weren't trained to detect inconsistencies. That's what made their report so devastating. They were simple, honest, and each monk described the same impossible pattern. She knew what we were about to ask before we asked it. When one monk asked whether she needed food, she answered before his mouth opened. When another approached her chamber to offer prayer, she thanked him for a prayer he had not yet recited. When a third attempted to observe her discreetly, she turned her head and said, "You can come in now," although he'd made no sound. The monks didn't call this supernatural. They didn't even call it strange. They called it disquieting. Quiet, in this context, meant more than silence. It meant something sinking beneath the surface, something happening underneath the structure of the day. She didn't claim to know the future. She didn't claim to hear thoughts. She didn't even acknowledge anything unusual. She simply interacted with people in ways that made them question the sequence of cause and effect. One monk wrote, "When she speaks, I feel like the conversation has already happened." Another wrote, "It is as if memory is sliding forward, as if I am remembering something she has not yet said." That phrasing, memory sliding forward, appears 7 times in the monastery's logs, written independently by different monks. Not identical wording, but close enough to indicate they were describing a similar perceptual distortion. Psychology has names for distorted time perception: dissociation, temporal disorientation, stress-induced cognitive disruption. These are documented in trauma victims, in soldiers, in patients with severe sleep deprivation. But they do not occur collectively. They do not synchronize across a group. And they do not all point to the same individual as the epicenter. This is where the Vatican stepped in. Quietly, without paperwork, without announcement. They sent a researcher, not a priest, not a theologian, not an exorcist. A behavioral scientist named Luca Romano. His report was supposed to diagnose mass psychogenic illness, the polite term for shared delusion. Instead, his report added the most disturbing detail yet. Romano stayed in the monastery for 3 days. His notes for the first day are clinical, composed, logical. His notes for the second day are shorter, more fragmented. His notes for the third day look like he was trying to outrun his own handwriting. On the morning of his 4th day, he rang the monastery bell, not the prayer bell, but the alarm bell, the bell that signals a death. When the monks rushed to the courtyard, they found him sitting on the ground, fully conscious, his hands covering his ears. He wasn't injured. He wasn't physically ill. He wasn't having a seizure. He was terrified. He told the abbot, "She speaks even when she is silent." When asked to explain, he said, "I hear answers to questions I haven't formed." Romano was escorted out the same afternoon. He never returned. The Vatican classified his report. 2 weeks later, he resigned from his position without explanation. 6 months later, he stopped answering inquiries entirely. A quiet exit from a man whose entire career had been built on understanding patterns. The most disturbing part of his report wasn't the content. It was the timestamps. The first page of his notes is dated correctly. The second page is dated 1 month earlier. The third page is dated 3 years in the future. The fourth page has no date at all. And on the fifth page, written faintly in the margin, barely visible, were 6 words. I don't know what is real. The Vatican took her from the monastery after that. Not because she did anything. She barely spoke. She barely moved. She barely reacted to anything around her. They moved her because the people around her were beginning to unravel. They took her to a facility that did not officially exist, a place used for cases that do not fit into theological categories or medical ones, a place where reality is observed as much as behavior. Her arrival there created the next fracture. They attempted a baseline interview, a simple set of questions used to establish mental state. Name, age, date, location. They asked her name first. She answered with the correct name. They confirmed it with the documents they still had. They asked her to repeat it. She said a different name, not a nickname, not a variation, a completely different name. They corrected her gently. She nodded as if acknowledging she had made a mistake. When asked to repeat the correct name again, she did so. They moved to the next question. Age. She answered correctly, then incorrectly, then a third number that did not correspond to any possible timeline. When the interviewer attempted to clarify, she said, "It depends which year we are in." At first they thought she meant memory confusion, a symptom of temporal disorientation. But she spoke too clearly, too confidently, too rationally. She wasn't confused. She was explaining something. The interview was halted. The staff requested psychological testing. They attempted a standard cognitive timeline assessment. When asked to place events in order: birth, childhood, adolescence, she paused, not in thought, in hesitation. Then she placed the events correctly, and then rearranged them. She placed her adolescence before her childhood, then placed adulthood before birth, then placed childhood after death. When the examiner told her the sequence was impossible, she replied, "Not if you were there." The examiner noted physiological symptoms of fear, elevated pulse, trembling hands in himself, not in her. She remained calm throughout. They tried something simpler. They gave her a series of cards with drawings, a house, a tree, a bird, a road. She arranged them in a sequence that made sense. Then she rearranged them in a sequence that did not. When asked why, she said, "Both are true depending on when you look." That sentence appears in multiple testimonies. Depending on when you look, not depending on perspective, not depending on memory, depending on when. The staff began noticing inconsistencies. Paperwork with duplicated timestamps. Notes written in handwriting that wasn't theirs. Conversations they remembered having in a different tone. Days that felt slightly longer than others, as if stretched. And the woman herself, always calm, always quiet, began saying things that broke the staff's composure. One told her during routine vitals, "We will take good care of you." She replied softly, "You already did, and you already failed." He asked, "When?" She said, "You'll remember." When the staff checked his schedule later, he found a medical log signed with his name for a procedure he had never performed. The log was dated 5 days in the future. No one could explain how it was printed. No one could explain how it got into the file. No one could explain why the woman smiled when they confronted her with it. Another staff member described hearing her humming through the intercom system, even though the intercom system had been disconnected for maintenance. The sound was faint, melodic, and familiar. When he approached her room, she was silent. He asked if she had been humming. "No," she said. But then she added, "Not yet." The intercom system, when tested the next morning, played 20 seconds of recorded humming. It matched her voice. It matched a melody she would hum 2 days later. The facility began losing staff, not physically, psychologically. Some asked to be transferred. Some requested leave. Some refused to work the night shift. Some complained the clocks were wrong. Some said they dreamed the same dream of the woman standing at their bedside whispering, "You were here before." The Vatican did not call it supernatural. They called it dangerous. Because she wasn't performing miracles. She wasn't causing destruction. She wasn't manipulating faith. She was disrupting the order that people use to make sense of reality. A single person capable of bending perception is alarming enough. A person who does it passively is something else entirely. By the end of her 3rd week there, the staff reported a new phenomenon. Memory drift. Not memory loss. Not confusion. Drift. People remembered conversations differently than they happened. People remembered her in clothing she never wore. People remembered her room having windows that were never built. People remembered a version of her smile that contradicted their own experience. One nurse wrote, "Sometimes I remember her being older, sometimes younger. Sometimes I think she has always been here." That line, "always been here," appears in 3 separate reports, all written by different people, all written on different days, all describing a feeling rather than event. The conclusion drawn by the Vatican's Internal Review Board was unprecedented in its wording. She disrupts temporal cohesion, not space, not emotion, not theology, time. Before I continue, if you're still here listening, tell me in the comments if you met someone who made you question the order of your memories. Would you think they were dangerous, tricky, or would you think the world itself was fragile? Your answer says more than you think. They kept her under constant observation, though the meaning of the word observation was becoming more unstable each day. It wasn't simply that she behaved unpredictably. It was that the observers themselves were no longer reliable instruments. One staff member reported she hadn't spoken to him all morning. Another insisted she'd spoken to him repeatedly. A third said she had left her room entirely. Even though the door logs showed no activity, each claimed absolute certainty. Each believed what they remembered. The Vatican's investigative framework was failing, and they knew it. They were dealing with something that undermined their foundational assumption. The different people looking at the same event would at least agree on the shape of it. With her, no 2 people agreed on basic form. At one point, 5 staff members were asked where she was sitting during a routine health check. One said she was on the bed. One said she was standing by the window. One said she was kneeling on the floor. One said she was sitting in the chair. One said she wasn't in the room. When they compared notes, they realized each had recorded observations at the same minute. There was only one camera in the room. When they played the footage back, the bed was empty. The chair was empty. The floor was empty. But the window reflection showed a faint silhouette of a woman seated perfectly still. When they replayed the footage, the silhouette was gone. The staff called it a glitch. The Vatican called it a risk. They began limiting interactions to the bare minimum. Measurements, nutrition, hygiene, evaluations, nothing more. But the less they interacted, the more their awareness of her shifted on its own. She became a presence felt more than perceived. They began describing moments in which the facility felt weighted, as if the air carried a memory of her. One guard said he felt watched even when her door was closed. Another said he felt as if she had been in a room seconds before he entered, even when the door log showed it had been locked all night. A third said that speaking near her door made him feel like he had already said those words sometime before. Temporal drift became a term used casually. It started as humor, a way to make sense of fragmented recall. But humor gave way to caution, and caution gave way to silence. The turning point came 3 weeks after her arrival. A staff member named Valenti was conducting a routine vitals check. His notes were straightforward until the final line. Patient's temperature normal, pulse stable, breathing steady. She asked me if I remembered the version of her that died. When questioned, he couldn't explain what she meant. He said she spoke calmly, almost kindly, as if clarifying a misunderstanding. He asked her, "What version?" She said, "The one that didn't make it here." He told her he didn't understand. She said, "You will." He left the room shaken but composed. He wrote the note clearly without tremor. Later, he wouldn't remember writing it. His signature wavered, though his handwriting did not. 2 days later, Valenti had a seizure in the staff stairwell. He was rushed to a hospital outside Vatican jurisdiction. Tests showed nothing unusual, no neurological abnormalities, no trauma, no metabolic issues. When he regained consciousness, he asked the same question she had asked him. Did she really die? He couldn't explain why he said it. Valenti never returned to the facility. After that, the Vatican ordered a full psychological sweep of all personnel. Nearly a third of the staff reported symptoms of temporal displacement, memory distortion, or déjà vécu, the clinical term for the feeling of reliving an event in extreme detail. The condition is rare and usually isolated, associated with epilepsy or trauma. It does not spread. It does not synchronize. It does not cluster around one person. Yet here it did. They attempted to isolate variables. Sleep deprivation? No. Environmental toxins? No. Carbon monoxide? No. Group stress disorder? Not consistent with the diversity of symptoms. They tested the building. They tested the water. They tested the food. They tested the staff. They tested everything except the one factor none of them wanted to name, even privately. Her. She remained calm throughout, cooperative, polite. She never resisted, never protested, never made demands. Her passivity made everything worse. It suggested she wasn't actively trying to cause anything, that whatever was happening happened naturally around her, as if she was a fixed point and the world was adjusting. One night, the staff heard a sound from her room, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingertips on metal. No alarms triggered. No door logs marked activity. When they checked, she was sitting on the bed with her hands in her lap. The tapping had stopped the moment they opened the door. She looked at them and said, "You're late." The logs showed they were early. She was placed under direct observation for the next 48 hours. During this period, something occurred that still appears in Vatican archives as an unsolved anomaly. At noon, her room was checked. She was lying on the bed, eyes open, breathing steady. At 12:03, she was observed sitting upright. At 12:04, she was observed sitting in the chair. At 12:05, she was lying on the floor. At 12:06, she was sitting on the bed again. The observer was questioned extensively. He insisted she had not moved, that each position felt like a memory he wasn't sure belonged to the present moment. When they reviewed the footage, her room was empty from 12:01 to 12:07. The timestamp was correct. The camera feed was not corrupted. The footage was authenticated. yet she was gone. At 12:08, she appeared again on the bed as if no time had passed. She wasn't disoriented. She wasn't confused. She wasn't distressed. She asked the observer, "Why did you leave the room?" He hadn't. 2 days later, a Vatican analyst assigned to review her psychological profile submitted a report that made the board halt all evaluation. The analyst wrote, "She understands time the way we understand direction. She moves through it, or it moves around her." He added one more line before resigning. "I no longer trust the order of my own memories." The Vatican convened a closed emergency session. She was labeled a Category 4 anomaly, a classification used only twice in modern history and never for a living person. Category I4 indicates a disruption of reality so severe that the event cannot be integrated into doctrine, science, or institutional record. She was the first human assigned that designation. They decided to end the experiment, not to harm her, but to end their involvement. They concluded they could not study her without destabilizing themselves. But before they could transfer her out, the event occurred. It happened at night during a storm. Power flickered. Generators kicked on. The halls dimmed. No alarm sounded, but every clock in the building shifted backward by 5 minutes. When power stabilized, the staff performed bed checks. Her room was empty. The door was locked from the outside. No windows. No vents large enough for human passage. No structural damage. She was gone. The Vatican executed a full sweep of the facility. No trace, no fingerprints, no disturbances. It was as if she had not exited, but as if the room had briefly existed without her and then resumed its previous state. She was declared missing. The Vatican sealed her file. The monk who had first interacted with her later said privately, "She told me she had already left before she arrived." No one knows what happened to her. No body was recovered. No sightings were confirmed. No forensic evidence was found. The Vatican's final internal memo contains one line: "We cannot contain what does not remain in sequence." If you're still with me in the dark, listening to this, tell me in the comments, do you think she escaped the facility? Or do you think she simply left the version of reality where they were holding her? They were certain she had vanished from the facility. But the Vatican's mistake was assuming disappearance meant absence. It took less than a week for them to realize they had misunderstood the situation entirely. She wasn't missing. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't fleeing anything. She was appearing. Not in places she had ever visited, not in places she should logically reach, but in places connected only by the people who had tried to observe her. Patterns emerged slowly at first. A monk reported seeing her silhouette reflected in a window, even though he was alone in the room. A bishop in France claimed she greeted him by name in a dream so vivid he woke with the taste of incense in his mouth. A theologian in Spain wrote that he remembered a conversation with her that had never happened, but felt as real as any other memory of his life. These were dismissed as stress responses, echoes, psychological imprinting. But the Vatican cannot ignore pattern. And the pattern grew. A file reviewer in Rome paused mid-work, realizing the paragraph he was reading was written in her voice. The handwriting was not hers. The document had been scanned 3 months before she was even discovered. But the phrasing, every word, matched something she had said during her first institutional interview. When asked if he might have misread it, he insisted he recognized her speech patterns. He said she had spoken softly, slowly, deliberately. He said the text felt like a memory of hearing her read it aloud. She had never visited Rome. The board decided to perform a cohesion audit, a comparison of witness statements, dates, and structural anomalies across all documents associated with her. It was supposed to be simple. It wasn't. Dates were misaligned not by days, but by years. Witness statements contradicted themselves in ways no human recall could produce. Some audio logs ended with words no one remembered speaking. One video of her early intake showed the room's walls subtly shifting between frames. The investigator who noticed that detail resigned the next morning. They attempted to centralize the anomalies, to pinpoint where her influence began, to trace it to a source. Instead, they discovered something far worse. Her influence was not limited to proximity. One of the Vatican archivists, a man who was hundreds of miles away, who had never met her, opened a sealed case file and felt an overwhelming sense of familiarity wash over him, as though he had heard her hum the melody written in the margins. There was no melody written in the margins. He closed the file, opened it again. This time the melody was there. 3 measures. Handwritten. Ink still drying. He called another archivist into the room. The page was blank. The melody was gone. He insisted he wasn't hallucinating. He even traced the notes onto his palm. By the time he showed his hand to his colleague, the ink he had drawn was smeared into a shape he could no longer interpret. Something subtle had begun happening, something the Vatican had no framework to understand. Reality wasn't warping in dramatic ways. No walls bending, no levitation, no cinematic distortions. The world itself was behaving normally. But people's memories of the world were not. Her presence, or the idea of her presence, behaved like a ripple, but not through space, through cognition. More than one researcher described it as remembering the wrong future. One priest recounted that he felt she had whispered to him, though he hadn't heard a sound. He said the whisper wasn't a voice, but a memory of a voice. He said her presence felt like déjà vu stretched thin until it tore. That phrase appears repeatedly. She is a memory of something that hasn't happened yet. Not prophecy, not time travel, not divinity. Memory. Out of sequence. Disobeying the rules of linear recall. The Vatican convened a containment meeting. The goal wasn't to recapture her, they had no idea where she was, but to determine if she was dangerous. Only 3 points were agreed upon. She did not manipulate or harm anyone intentionally. She destabilized perception merely by being observed. The more people studied her, the more reality drifted. But the drift wasn't random. It followed the people who had interacted with her. The first verified external event occurred in Florence. A psychologist assigned to review the early monastery logs called the Vatican in a panic. He claimed he saw her sitting in a public cafe. He described her clothing, her expression, her calm posture. He said she was staring at him with the softness of recognition. But the CCTV footage from the cafe showed him sitting alone, staring at nothing, speaking softly under his breath. When he was interviewed the next day, he was unable to recall the incident at all. The Vatican showed him the cafe footage. He watched himself having a conversation with empty air. He frowned, leaned back, and said, "That's not me." He pointed at the screen. "That version is older." It wasn't. He was the same age. He claimed his reflection in the cafe window had looked younger than he was now. He claimed the him in the video had looked older than he ever remembered being. He claimed both were correct. 2 days later, he disappeared from his home without packing a single item. Neighbors reported hearing footsteps in his hallway hours before he vanished. The timestamp of the report doesn't match any known timeline of the day. The Vatican referred to the event as an echo. Their wording grew stranger as the case expanded. An echo is something that repeats after the source. But this was repeating before. Another incident occurred in Munich. A theology student with no connection to the case began drawing her face repeatedly in the margins of his notebook, despite never having seen her. He said the face appeared in his dreams. He said she taught him a sentence he couldn't remember upon waking. He didn't recognize the Vatican sketch of her. He insisted the face he drew wasn't hers. But the resemblance was unmistakable. The drift began spreading. Not geographically, cognitively, like a thought traveling between people who had never spoken to each other. The Vatican attempted something drastic, a blackout order. No one was permitted to speak her name. All written references were sealed. Transcripts were reclassified. Audio logs were locked in vaults. Digital files were erased. But the absence backfired. When they tried to remove her, she appeared more. Silence became the medium she used to exist. Staff who had never met her began dreaming of hallways she'd walked. Archivists began finding their own handwriting in files they had not written. Librarians reported books misshelving themselves into chronological sequences that made no sense. The Vatican's final attempt was not spiritual or scientific. It was logical. They tried to create a timeline in which she had never entered their system. A retroactive correction. A procedural erasure. A bureaucratic recalibration of reality. The moment they did it, one archivist reported a migraine so intense he collapsed. Another said the room tilted. A third insisted she saw 2 versions of the same calendar page overlapping. The erasure didn't work. She remained. If anything, she became more present the more they tried to remove her. It was then and only then that one cardinal finally asked the question no one wanted to ask. What if she was never meant to be contained in sequence? And the analyst beside him quietly answered, what if sequence is the illusion? Before I go further, if you're still listening in the dark, tell me in the comments. If a person appears in memories, in dreams, in written records they never touched, do you believe they're haunting the world? Or do you believe the world is remembering them incorrectly? The Vatican assumed her influence spread outward like heat or sound or contagion. But that was a human assumption. Linear, directional, predictable. What they didn't understand was that her influence didn't spread. It surfaced. Like something rising through layers of water, not moving outward but upward, appearing wherever the structure of reality was thin enough for it to break through. They first realized this when reports stopped following geographic patterns. They started following emotional ones. A linguist in Portugal, who had once translated documents about her, reported losing a full hour of his afternoon. Not in a blackout, in a duplication. He remembered the same hour twice, 2 different versions of it, 2 different sequences of thoughts, both equally vivid, both equally real. A nun in Argentina dreamt of walking behind her through a corridor she had never seen before. She described the corridor's width, its stone texture, its faint light coming through an archway. When the Vatican heard the description, they recognized it instantly. It was the hallway outside the chamber where the woman had been kept. The nun had never been to Italy. A librarian in India found a page in a manuscript that shifted languages each time she blinked. First Latin, then Italian, then blank. She thought she was losing her mind until she noticed that the text, in whichever language it appeared, always referred to the same unnamed woman. But she had never heard of the case. There was no external connection linking these people, no communication, no shared culture, nothing to explain the cohesion between their experiences. The Vatican began categorizing incidents as echoes, though the term was becoming laughably insufficient. Echoes imply repetition, but these were anticipations, memories of events that hadn't happened yet, or that had happened somewhere else entirely. One cardinal used a different term, cross timelines. It was dismissed as metaphor. It wasn't. The turning point came during what should have been a routine review of her earliest monastery documents. A junior archivist opened the file, expecting to find the same brittle, yellowed pages. Instead, he found a page he had never seen before. A page that wasn't in any catalog. A page written in handwriting that didn't match any monk. He assumed it was misfiled, until he read the content. It described events from the monastery, events that would happen 2 days later. Not predictions, not prophecies. Descriptions, accurate down to the minute. One line read, "Brother Matteo will drop the candle at dusk and say he does not know why he feels watched." 2 days later, Brother Matteo did exactly that. Another line read, "The archivist reviewing this will think he is hallucinating." He did. The Vatican attempted to carbon date the page. The results came back inconclusive, not because the ink was new, but because the ink registered as both old and new simultaneously. Temporal inconsistency. The Vatican's term, not mine. The archivist refused to touch the file after that. One said she felt as if someone behind her was reading over her shoulder, even though she was alone. Another said the pages whispered, though not in sound and suggestion. The Vatican sealed the file, locked it in a vault, welded the vault shut. The next morning, the file was found on a desk in a different building. No forced entry, no tampering, no damage. Just a file placed neatly where someone wanted it to be found. This was when the Vatican began fearing something that had nothing to do with miracles or demons. They feared agency. Not her agency. Not the woman's. The agency of whatever reality was doing around her. You see, nothing she did was intentional. She didn't summon anything. She didn't command anything. She didn't manipulate the laws of time or memory. Things simply happened around her, and continued happening even after she vanished. The cardinal overseeing the case wrote in his private journal, "It is not that she bends reality. It is that reality bends to accommodate her. Whatever she was, whatever she represented, whatever violated every rule of sequence and causality, it didn't stop when she disappeared. If anything, it stabilized, as though removing her from observation allowed the phenomenon to distribute itself freely." The first catastrophe happened in northern Italy. A train conductor reported seeing a woman sitting alone in the first car, facing the wrong direction. She did not acknowledge him. She did not blink. She did not move. When he walked past her, he felt time slow, not dramatically, but perceptibly. He looked out the window. The trees outside were frozen mid-sway. He looked back. She was gone. The security cameras on the train showed nothing unusual, except for one frame, one single frame showing her seated in the car. The timestamp on the frame matched his account. But the metadata said the frame was recorded 5 years earlier. This was followed by similar incidents. A woman matching her description appearing in airport reflections, in glass doors, in bus windows, in phone screens, in the periphery of CCTV systems, in the static between broadcasts. Always calm, always composed, always silent, and always there for an instant too long to be dismissed. She was becoming not a person, but a phenomenon. The Vatican attempted one final analysis, a conceptual rather than scientific one. They compared every known report of her to every known anomaly. Location didn't matter. Time didn't matter. Sequence didn't matter. What mattered was something else, emotion. Every incident occurred in the presence of someone who was experiencing uncertainty, fear, grief, doubt. The psychological states that loosen the mind's grip on linear reality. She appeared wherever reality trembled. Not to harm, not to speak, not to intervene, but to exist. As if she was not a person with a history, but a footprint of something deeper. Something the human mind encountered when its framework falters. One analyst wrote, "She is the shape of a question the world is not designed to answer." This case file should end with a conclusion. But instead it ends the way her presence always ended, in ambiguity. One of the last Vatican analysts assigned to the case wrote, before resigning, "I saw her outside my window. I blinked, and she was on the other side of the glass. I blinked again, and she was gone. I don't know which version was real. Reality is supposed to be consistent, predictable, sequential. She broke that. And the Vatican learned something they've never admitted publicly. Reality does not break cleanly. It fractures along the things we fear the most. If you're still here with me in the dark, tell me in the comments. Do you think she was a person who changed reality? Or do you think she was the result of a reality already beginning to change? If you haven't already, subscribe. In the final months of the investigation, the Vatican's records no longer resembled case files. They resembled confessions, not of guilt, but of uncertainty. Pages filled with questions written in the margins. Sentences crossed out and rewritten in different tenses. Reports submitted twice with different content each time, as if the same investigator had lived two separate versions of the same day. One entry asked, in careful handwriting, "Have we already finished this case?" The same page, rewritten hours later, said, "Why does it feel like this began after it ended?" That was the state of the institution in her absence. They thought her disappearance would restore stability. Instead, it destabilized everything else. The board ordered all active investigators to cease work. They claimed the case was corrupting the integrity of the archival system. Reality, they said, had become porous. But by then, the phenomenon had already spread too widely to contain. The Vatican began receiving letters from across the world, all describing the same woman, all written by people who had no way of knowing the case existed. Most letters were discarded as coincidence. Some were too detailed to ignore. A fisherman in Croatia wrote that he saw her standing on the pier at dawn. Not walking, not approaching, just standing, staring into the water. He went to ask if she needed help. When he reached her, she was gone, but the water was still rippling outward from where she had stood. A schoolteacher in Chile claimed she saw the woman reflected in a student's eyes, only for a second. A blink. But the face in the reflection was not the student's. It was hers. A nurse in Canada reported hearing someone softly humming in an empty operating theater. The melody was one the Vatican recognized, the same melody that had appeared in their misdated pages, the one that had shown up in audio logs no one remembered recording. The Vatican tried to dismiss these accounts. They couldn't, because the descriptions were all too consistent. Her posture, her expression, the calmness, the stillness. And because every report contained a detail that matched the original anomaly. She looked at me like she already knew what I was going to say. What terrified the Vatican wasn't the sightings. It was the implication that she was no longer bound to the context in which she was discovered. She wasn't tied to a place or a building or any timeline her life had once occupied. She was showing up everywhere. Human perception faltered. In airports, on highways at night, in crowded shopping malls, in empty churches, in moments of deep grief, fear, confusion. She became a presence that existed at the exact intersection between memory and uncertainty. The Vatican decided to consult one final expert, someone outside their theological structure, someone who had nothing to lose by speaking plainly. A cognitive scientist named Dr. Elia Moretti. Moretti reviewed every testimony, every anomaly, every contradiction, every timestamp, audio file, misdated note, CCTV frame. She studied the case not as a phenomenon, but as a pathology. After 3 months, she delivered a single conclusion. She is not altering reality. Reality is altering its recall of her. They asked what that meant. She said, "The world treats her like a missing variable. It keeps trying to solve for her. It keeps adjusting until she fits." One priest asked if that meant she had supernatural power. Moretti shook her head. "No, she is not supernatural. She is miscategorized." "What category does she belong to?" Moretti hesitated before answering. "Something that does not depend on linear time to exist." The Vatican tried desperately to reject this interpretation, not because it was impossible, but because it implied they no longer had authority over their own records. If the world was misremembering her, so were they. And if they were misremembering her, they had no way of knowing what parts of the case were real. They decided to close the investigation. They gathered every document, every witness report, every scrap of audio and video, and locked it all in a vault beneath the archives. A vault that required 5 keys. A vault no one was permitted to enter again. That should have been the end. But endings are linear. She was not. The last recorded manifestation occurred 6 years after her disappearance. A Vatican archivist, a young man with no connection to the original case, was working late. He left his desk for a moment to retrieve a folder. When he returned, a page was sitting on his chair. It wasn't from the file he was working on. It wasn't from any file in his department. It was from her case. A page that should have been locked in the vault. A page that had been carbon-sealed. Numbered, stored, erased from public record. On the page was half a sentence. "She does not move through time. Time moves through..." It cut off. The archivist froze. He flipped the page over. Nothing. He went to report it to his supervisor. When they returned to his desk, the page was gone. He insisted he had held it in his hands. The supervisor insisted he hadn't. The CCTV footage showed something else entirely. At the moment he picked up the page, the camera glitched. Only for a second. A flicker. When the image returned, the archivist was still sitting. But his hands were empty. He resigned the next day. The Vatican entered one final note into the sealed file. She continues to manifest wherever doubt and memory intersect. That was the last official statement ever written about her. But unofficially, people still report seeing her. Not often. Not dramatically. Just in the corner of a reflection. In the echo of a dream they can't fully recall. In a sentence they feel like they've heard before. In the sense that the moment they're living has already been lived by someone else. Some believe she is an apparition. Some believe she is an unclassified psychological phenomenon. Some believe she is the embodiment of human uncertainty. Some believe she is mirror of the world's fractures. But the Vatican's most private conclusion, the one they refused to publish, was simpler. She is not a threat. She is a reminder, Thais, that our understanding of reality is only one version of it. If you're still here with me in the dark, tell me in the comments. Do you think she was a singular anomaly, or the first visible sign of something the world has always hidden? And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.